Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
I read the other day about a deal that went for about $23.5 million, and now I hear one's coming down for about $25 million. Am I talking about big business? You bet I am. Big business of baseball. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll take a look at the game, America's game, baseball, where it's been, where it is, and where it's going. Our panelists are John Rouse, our producer and a member of the political science faculty at Ball State, Pat Quinn, head baseball coach at Ball State University, Carl Erskine, president of First National Bank in Anderson, who you might remember as a pitching star for the old Brooklyn and L.A. Dodgers, and Ron LeMasters, sports editor of the Muncie Star. John, Don Zimmer, now manager of the Cubs and former major leaguer, says it's the same game it was back in the 50s. We've still got 90 feet between the bases, 60 feet 6 inches from pitcher's mound to home plate, 3 outs, 4 balls, 3 strikes. So it is the same game, sort of, isn't it?
But the culture has changed, and the culture of the country has changed. I think, for example, if you look at corporate behavior, the teams were family teams. There was the Yankee team, the Red Sox, the O'Malleys on the Dodgers, Stoneham on the Giants. There were Bush in St. Louis. There was Griffith in Washington. So I think back in the 1950s, it was a family game. Today, it is a corporate game. It is a big business game. I would also say, in terms of the culture of baseball, as it's changed since the 1950s, is that in the 1950s, they played in baseball parks. Today, they play in oval football stadiums. And so the culture of the game has changed to the point that a lot of teams play in the multi-purpose parks, and so therefore baseball has changed. So the game may be the same except for perhaps the DH and other kinds of things, and also in terms of the economics, they had 16 teams at that time. I think you'd have to argue that baseball, in terms of competition perhaps, was better at that time, because at that time in 1950, the ratio between the minor league and the major leagues was something like 27-1. 27 players in the minors to that one in the majors. Today, it's something like 6-1.
Carl Zim was an old teammate of yours. Certainly the environment, as John says, is different. Do you agree with Zim that it's basically the same game it was?
Yeah, it's both. And they're both right. I was back on the bench just in Cincinnati a couple days ago talking to current players, and how you throw the curveball, how you hit the curveball, how you stay down on a ground ball, what you do in the outfield on a ball hit straight to you. All those techniques are basically the same. So the game fundamentally on the field or between the foul lines hasn't changed much, although there's specialty pitches now that we didn't call the same things years ago. The split-finger fastball seems like a new innovation. No, that's a spin-off of the old forkball, which Elroy Face used effectively back in the 50s. There are similarities. I see the changes in a different way, and given that society's different, when I played in the late 40s through the 1950s to the 1960s, our game was much different than the 1920s and the 1930s because the culture was different. And the old players used to come back on the bench and they'd say, you guys, you're a bunch of softies. Why, we used to travel and stay in flea bag hotel, and you guys got it nice. You got TV now, it's going to ruin the game. You're going to start flying, they'll lose a whole franchise one of these days in an airplane. I mean, all the negatives about the current culture things that were happening in the 50s. Now we're in the 90s, looking at the 50s. And so we've got the same kind of social changes, but the magic of baseball, to me, is that it has not fundamentally changed, and that we grow up appreciating a play that's made a certain way, and that play's made basically the same way that it was in the 1920s when the shortstop goes behind third base and comes up with a jump throw to nail a guy at second on a forced play. Pat, your team makes that play, right, today?
We try to.
Yeah, okay. I see you play. You've got a good baseball at Ball State. So this is a wonderful subject because it's typical of the hot stove baseball conversations that have kept this game America #1 game. So we can sit here and we will analyze a lot of neat changes that have taken place. And there's debatable whether they're better or worse.
Ron, the press boxes are air-conditioned now. I suppose that's a little better, but aside from that, does it look any different from the press box?
On the field, no, it doesn't, Larry. I think where it looks different from the media perspective is the way that it's reported these days. In 1950, TV was still a struggling industry. Sports Illustrated was still 4 years away. Since that time, a lot of social change has come about. The advent of television took away the play-by-play that was the forte of the sports writer of years ago. We are now, newspapers begin to be called upon to report different aspects, a softer aspect of it, some of the social issues. Today you have alternate lifestyles. You have the advent of drugs. You have big money and big money problems. Racism is an issue. I'm sure that in Carl's day and before, third baseman had hemorrhoids. You didn't hear about it back then. You hear about it now. Babe Ruth's famous stomach ache was something certainly a lot more serious, and it wasn't really until after his death, some 23 or 24 years after that incident, that word even started to get out that it was related to venereal disease and some alcoholism and some other things. So I think the fan wants a little more than just the line score, the box score, who drove in the winning run. It's there are a lot fewer decimal points, a lot fewer statistics on the sports page. That plus the fact that in 1950, baseball was king on the sports page, in season and often out of season. Since then, there have been probably a 400% increase in professional sports franchises. Newspaper space has stayed the same, or in a lot of instances gotten smaller. There's a lot more competition for baseball on America's sports pages these days. And it's a whole new ballgame from the perspective of the press box.
No, does the fan want more? The players want more too, Pat. You growing any players here at Ball State that you sign those $25 million contracts? That's a lot of money.
Well, you know, as a comparison, I remember when I first got into college baseball, and even when I was a high school coach, if a college coach came into a high school player's living room and sat down with his family and offered him a third of a scholarship, the kid and the family were ecstatic to have an opportunity to go to college and play baseball at a major institution. Now they're looking for the full scholarship, the job that you can get them on the side to supplement their scholarship, where can you place them in the summer, that type of thing. And, you know, I think it's a reflection of society. You know, in accordance with what Ron was saying, I can remember learning the game of baseball from my father, going into Forbes Field and seeing the green grass and the blue sky, doing the same thing at Crosley Field in Cincinnati. And I think I really felt a closeness to my father from learning the game, from sitting at his side at a baseball game. Or like Ron said, listening to the play-by-play over the radio, getting up the next morning, taking the sports page from the Cincinnati Enquirer and going through the boxes. Today, the kids don't do that with their fathers anymore. I think that society has changed everything that we know. And I think it's hurt the game in some respects. Yeah, you know, I go back to 1949 when I first went to a baseball game, and my father took my brother and me to see the Red Sox play. We sat in center field in the bleachers in Fenway Park. I was about 7. My brother must have been about 5. But it was a thing where the family went on the 4th of July. And in terms of my introduction to baseball in the 1950s as a fan, I remember these 3 things. First of all, I went to the 1955 World Series for the first 2 games. Carl was playing in that series. And then I went to the 1958 All-Star game in Baltimore. But I can tell a story that goes back to 1954 when I was about 12. Fenway Park was always a good babysitter or child sitter for my parents, and so they would send us off to Fenway Park. It was a safe place to go in Boston. And so my brother and I were sitting in the right field bleachers down there, deep down in the bleachers, and the Red Sox were behind by 3 runs, as I recall. They got the bases loaded, and I didn't know who this guy was, but this guy by the name of Mickey Owen comes up with 2 men out, and he hits a home run up into the screen. So in terms of my experience, Fenway Park has not changed in the last 40 years. Many other things have changed, but I remember Mickey Owen whom I didn't know who he really was at the time, hitting that home run. So I think we were shaped by those early experiences that we had with baseball in the 1950s.
If it's not a lot different, is it better or is it worse? There seems to be a general agreement that with a greater number of players, number of teams, that in fact we've got a little lower quality of player in the major leagues.
You cannot analyze whether it's better or worse. You can only say it's different, and a lot of the good things are still there. And listening to John talk about this with that gleam in his eye of sitting in the stands going with his father, you know, that hasn't left the game. Because now, my mail, I still get mail from kids writing for autographs on baseball cards. And one of the new things that's developed are father and son, father and daughter, mother and son, all the family things, collecting baseball memorabilia and baseball cards. And a lot of the cards I sign and send back are husband's birthday presents from a wife or from a son or and so on, the family thing. That has brought the family together, and the Dodgers have made a strong appeal to family attendance by keeping their prices probably lower than anybody in the National League. And in the minor leagues, not far from here at Louisville, A. Ray Smith, who owns the team, has made a tremendous effort to make it a family affair, and he drew, about 4 or 5 years ago, drew over 1 million people, first time in the minor leagues any club ever drew that. I think the culture's changed, but some of those good values are still in and around baseball. And I don't think we've lost all of that, John, just because we're in a new era. It's just being done in a little different way.
It's certainly a business now. We're looking at, as I said, where the employees, if you can call baseball players the employees, they're not property anymore. The employees are negotiating contracts of what was Ken Seiko's $23.5 million. Strawberry says he wants $25 million. Money certainly has had to change the games. It changed the players.
I love the comment I read somewhere when some sharp newspaper guy said to Joe DiMaggio, if you were sitting down with Steinbrenner today, Joe, and negotiating, what would it be like? You know, Winfield had just signed some astronomical contract. So what would it be like sitting down, Joe DiMaggio, with George Steinbrenner today? What would you say to him? He said, I'd look across the desk and say, hello, partner.
Literally. Has it changed players, all the money around?
I think it has. I can't put my finger on statistics or prime examples. I think it has humanized the players. I think this whole, the whole thing, the money included, has humanized players. Back in Carl's era, the 3 center fielders, Mays, Mantle, and Snyder, those guys were larger than life. Certainly a Babe Ruth, a Lou Gehrig, some of those people were larger than life. They were heroes that took on almost a mythical being in the minds of a lot of people. The way things have turned out, and especially with the money and the haggling over money, players are very, very human these days. I think fans tend to look at them a little differently. I know a lot of people who are working in a factory for what is pretty good money in this day and age look at a guy who stands in right field and scratches himself and spits all day making $23.5 million. They say, what in the world has this world come to? I think they're the same players. I think they're probably bigger and stronger and faster. I think there are more of those bigger, stronger, faster players. Mention was made a moment ago of there not being the same quality players given the expansion. I think the quality has expanded to meet that demand. I think back in the days of 16 major league teams, there were a lot of guys playing at Indianapolis and other teams in the American Association, the International League, the Pacific Coast League, who were every bit as good as people playing in the majors today. They just did not have a spot on a roster. I think the quality is there. It's I don't think players are playing as long. They're making that kind of money. They don't need to play that long. They play a few years, decide that they can, if they've invested their money, they get tired of playing, they go on to other things.
If I can get some politics and economics in this, we look at the social factors in terms of different, blacks have had opportunities, and I forget what the percent of blacks is. I think the Hispanic and the black population in the days of baseball is about 28%. Let me ask you, all of you, this question. Is it a socioeconomic thing, for example, Pat, that you get a a kid from a more poor background being more motivated than a kid that comes from a middle-class background? Does economic background have anything to do with motivation?
Well, I think that a lot of times I can relate a little bit to that because we've got a young man that comes from a very poor background up in Michigan. And he told me that he wanted to use baseball and his education at Ball State as a vehicle never to go back into that community again. He wanted to better himself and be able to provide for his mother and father as they got a little bit older and could not work as migrant workers. So I think it's definitely a motivation in a lot of cases.
Do you think that most of the players come from middle-class backgrounds then?
I think the majority of the players that I see in college today are coming from middle-class backgrounds. I think the reason for that is because you have to go into college baseball without a full scholarship. It's not like a football or a basketball situation where you can go into a poor home, give an individual a full scholarship, and he can afford to come to college. We give a guy a third or two-thirds scholarship. They still have to make up the difference, and so there has to be some money in the family in order to be able to afford the education.
What sort of limitations do you have in college baseball that college football and basketball aren't living with?
Well, we're not unique to that. I think that any sport at the college level outside of football and basketball are working with financial restrictions and budget and scholarships. And we, of course, don't have the TV contracts that football and basketball have. So I think we have to put together financial packages through financial aid, academic programs, athletic scholarships in order to attract the quality baseball player. And then professional baseball comes in today, and we had a young man that was a fifth-round draft choice of the Atlanta Braves, and he currently has turned down over $100,000 to come to Ball State to play baseball. Now, the education has to be very important to him in order to do that. But a lot of young men that would be in that financial situation, I'm sure, would sign and forego a college education at this point.
Has college helped baseball, Carl? Certainly you're getting a lot more college players into the system now than you did years ago.
Well, the whole system's changed in terms of minor leagues, and that's where most of your players now are college recruits rather than minor league recruits, as the old concept used to be. When I graduated from high school in 1945, about 10% of our class would go to college. Most of us didn't even think about going to college. That's far, far different today. I think it's helped the game in terms of the cultural values that's brought. I think the quality of college baseball, high school baseball, right here in Indiana, high school baseball is so much better because of the state tournament that's now held, and I think the quality is better. What is not as strong as it once was is the old semi-pro leagues where you could play all summer, and I bet you have trouble, Pat, finding places for your good players to play after your season's over, because there's not enough good minor league, good semi-pro baseball, twilight leagues and so on. Although there's a comeback in Southern California to hardball, as we used to call it, and there are a lot of leagues developing in Southern California of baseball, and softball is big here in our part of the world. In Southern California, I can tell you, real baseball is having a resurgence, and so that could help. Your question, I think it's better. I think players, my son went to University of Texas on a full-ride scholarship for baseball, and I went down and watched their workouts, and I never worked that hard in the minor leagues. I'm telling you, I didn't have as good of facilities in the minor league. There was more emphasis put on his baseball career while he was at University of Texas than I had in my early days, and they have excellent coaches. Many are former major league players now who are coaching in the good college levels of the Southwest schools. We have long seasons. Well, they must have a 70-game schedule down there, plus their playoffs. What's your schedule? Well,
the NCAA a few years ago restricted everybody now to 60 games in the spring.
Okay.
So whether you're south or west and here, it's 60, but they still have better weather than we do.
Yeah, they have good weather, and then their playoffs and all add up to really almost a full minor league season. So I think in a sense, players are not disadvantaged today in getting good training if they're good enough to make a college-level team. I think the quality has improved broadly. I think there's just good recruiting potentials in the colleges now, and it's probably as selective as it ever was. The big change to me was there were 800 players under contract with the Dodgers when I played, and we were all on a one-year contract with options for the minor leagues, and they had 24 minor league teams, your job was never safe. You just had to push all the time, and even a good year did not guarantee you much the next year. You had to come back to spring training, have a good spring, and it took you a long time to get established. I think that's a major change. Today, a high draft choice gets a lot of money, and they're going to give him as much time. They're going to help him as much. He's going to have more choices of how he conditions and gets ready. In my day, there was no choice. You had a little tender arm, and it was your turn to pitch. You didn't tell anybody. You couldn't afford to.
You know, I think that's an interesting observation, because it implies that baseball is much more available to a lot more people today. If we go back to the early 1950s and we see that the Dodgers and the Yankees played those series in New York, and the baseball families would come to New York and they would meet. It was kind of a traditional thing, because those were the strongest teams. The New York teams, the Brooklyn team was strong. And so as we look at corporate behavior in America and how cities have expanded, I mean, at that time in 1950, New York City was the city. Today, it's only one of 15 or 20 cities. So we've seen an increase in the population in this country of 65% since that time. Also, the focus upon entertainment. So baseball is entertainment, and these people are entertaining others on television. So it appears that baseball is much more available. But Carl, you're saying in a sense that in some respects the competition is not as keen as it was in the 1950s.
Well, I'm not sure I meant that, to say that. I think the game has to be more selective today. It's interesting. There's been a flip-flop. In my day, you could get signed easy, because I say easier, because the scout would say, I think this boy could play at the AA level. Okay, or I think this boy could play at the Class B level. There were several classifications we don't have today. And there were a lot more opportunities to get signed. And free agents could walk on and maybe get signed. You can't do that today. And there were only 8 teams in the big leagues in each league, but there were numerous minor league teams. Today, you have 10 more major league teams and far fewer minor league teams. So the scout today says, well, this boy's a good prospect, but I don't see him as a major league prospect. He doesn't get a chance. Only the player who gets carded as a major league potential gets signed to go into the few minor leagues. The Dodgers have 5 teams as opposed to 24 in the old days. And most clubs are that way. So I think it's harder to get signed today, but once you get signed, you got a better shot at getting the big leagues. In my day, it was just the opposite. You might get signed, but your chance to make it in those few jobs at the top were really very, very tough. So I see a lot of good players today who get released in the minor leagues, and they can't get re-signed. They're good players, but they are not considered, at least by those who make the decisions, as being a major league prospect. They could be AAA, AA, which are outstanding players, but not major league players, and so they get wiped out.
Well, I think you brought up a real good point when you talked about the availability of sandlot baseball, too.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, we didn't have swim clubs, soccer, football, the way it is now, basketball, and the emphasis it is now. And I think now you see the kids in the summertime going out to the swim clubs, the tennis courts, et cetera, and I don't think you see as many summer baseball activities there. There's a lot of opportunities for players to excel at certain levels, but I don't think the marginal player is getting an opportunity to play as much anymore.
If I can ask you guys some questions before our time runs out. DH, will the DH still be around in another 10 years? Carpets, will we go back to baseball stadiums? For example, the Giants are thinking about building a stadium in San Jose, which is going to be a baseball stadium, I presume. Of course, they have grass already. Grass and carpets, are we going to get away from those two things? Carpets and also the DH.
Well, you know, there's an economic factor there that has nothing to do with the game. It's the fact that a lot of these are football stadiums, and they double for a lot of things. The artificial surface has now been improved so much that you can hardly rain a game out on artificial surface anymore. And that's an economic factor that helps baseball, to not ever have to call a game because of weather, or practically never. The artificial surface, I think it's here to stay. You hear the debate about going back to the old fields, but and it's a magic feeling to go to Wrigley Field or go to Dodger Stadium and see grass and dirt and so on. But as time passes, the play is so consistent on that artificial surface. You get very few freak bounces.
But you get bad knees, don't you?
Yeah, there's trade-offs in anything, I guess. But I'm not an advocate of that. I'm just saying I think that it's here to stay. I mean, I liked baseball the way it was when I played.
Well, the Cardinals
changing.
in St. Louis no longer have a football team there. It seems that
Right.
if they want to be purists, they could go back to
Yeah, but John,
grass.
I think you have to take into consideration the weather factors.
Oh, that's what you're saying.
With the wear and tear on the grass and the rain factor, trying to get the game in, and the humidity, it's tough to get a good crop of grass when you're playing 81 home games and trying to go against the elements.
Pat, is the DH here to stay?
I think so, yes.
National League going to pick up on it?
I don't think the National League will, but I think that the American League is going to stand firm on it.
What do you got here, Carl?
Well, you know,
Little
when
new
you start
equipment?
trying to compare the old days to the new days, it's difficult, but there have been some changes. One of the big changes has been in equipment. What I'm putting on my hand is a remade 1950s model pitcher's glove made by Nakona, which I used to be signed with, and they're recreating these as collector's items. This glove was designed, and in the 50s, the gloves started getting bigger.
That's what I'd buy for my kid who's 6 years old now.
This glove has got so much leather in it, weighs about 8 pounds, and Duke Snyder
Bigger
used to
than
look
your
at
kid.
this glove and he'd say to me, Carl, if you pitch in that, you're not only going to have a sore right arm, you'll have a sore left arm. That thing is heavy. But they used to make the gloves with a big heel and a pocket and stubby fingers. That was just a style.
Yeah.
And years before, it used to be even smaller, much smaller than this. But the 1950s, that's what the glove looked like. And you had to break it in, and you had a pocket. And you always heard, use 2 hands when you catch the ball. Always use 2 hands. Well, you had to,
Sure.
practically, okay? Now, here's a glove that's made in the current styling. And if you'll notice, there's much difference. This is shaped like your hand. It has a small heel. It has practically no pocket because it's all pocket. And that makes a tremendous difference in defense. But it's a trade-off or an offset to the new fast infields, which the balls get through so much faster. And this sort of balances that. And guys can catch balls today that this glove would hardly have been able to handle. And so that's one of the major equipment changes that's kind of stabilized baseball defense when you've got so much more offense.
And that's not even the biggest one they make, by
Probably
any
not.
means.
This is made out of kangaroo skin hide.
We're
and
out
it's
of time
light.
here.
It's very
Thanks,
light.
John Rouse, Pat Quinn, Carl Erskine, Ron LeMasters for being with us today. I'm Larry Lough. Go see a ball game. See you next week on Public Affairs Roundtable.
Public Affairs Roundtable is produced in the studios of WIPB Channel 49 on the campus of Ball State University. The producer is John Rouse. Listener comments are welcome.